La idea carguemos el archivo. Se lo devuelvan a un...
Y si no, pone un archivo, un partido de Platense y listo, no pasa nada.
Mi mouse murió en el viaje y no conseguí hoy a la mañana comprarlo. Con eso.
Gracias. Maya is holding microphone.
It's okay?
Just,
It's okay?
Yeah.
Can you read? Yeah.
let's see. I guess.
If it is possible, close to the
Close.
microphone. Okay? Good. More. Wait.
But I need to go to check my eyes because I think I need glasses.
I see.
So I have to.
Okay, use the glasses. It's easy. you should use glasses.
But I have to check because I never went. Now it's the time. It's the age of
Yeah, of
the
course.
glass age.
You should. Until my 40s, I never use glasses. A visual perfect. But
Mine is 44 and I think now it's time. I think.
yes, more or less. The presbycia.
Yes.
Hello, I have another translation. The car or the ship. Yes. If I saw it, shall we stop? Yeah, come. So I welcome you to our second presentation part. We have 4 presentations left. One from yesterday, so we the first part will be Dana with her presentation and Marcelo with his presentation. Then we have a little coffee break, and I would like to ask you, all those who filled this form for the reimbursement, the company, then I need the signature from you. So we have a little coffee break, and then we can listen to Fabia instead of.
Okay. I'm going to introduce Dana now. Is it on? Yeah, I didn't want to move it because Dana's a bit smaller. So Dana Eichhorst completed her BA and MA in Jewish Studies.
Just wait. Yeah, Marcel, we need you. The master of my work.
Nee, mag jetzt sage ich nochmal.
Ich bin so alt, da gab es noch kein Baby.
Aber das wäre die Entsprechung.
Ja.
So, Dana completed her Magister in Jewish Studies and History of Art at the Free University in Berlin. And during this time, she also worked at the Institute of Philosophy with Professor Schmidt-Bigelman on a research project about Christian Kabbalah. And then she also went on for many years to teach at the FU, where she also taught me. And she received her PhD from the Cohen Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science at Tel Aviv University, under the supervision of Josef Schwarz. Her dissertation has since been published as her most recent monograph, Kabbalah for Medieval Ashkenaz and Renaissance Christian Theology, Elazar Worms and Egidio David Talbot. And I can really recommend the book. This is a completely new perspective on the study of Kabbalah and on the conceptual frameworks through which it has traditionally been understood. Within our project, Dana serves as our TI specialist. So she oversees our digital edition and makes sure we stick to the guidelines. And she also has been a pillar of steadiness and reliability. And to put it in Annette's words, she is the colleague one should fly to the Mars with. So please welcome now Dana.
Thank you, Annemie. Taking up the Mars theme, it's getting metaphysical. I'm not going to speak anything like not real, so let's talk about realness later. But I'm going to talk about narratives and tales and stories and legends, and to give a different perspectives on our common theme, the church up in past days, Torah scrolls. So, and to give a little bit of a basement information, I will start by the biblical account of the revelation of the divine word to Moses, as recorded in the text of the Torah itself, is a starting point for a rich mythology surrounding the Torah. It is linked to the description of 2 significant sacred acts of writing, which we learn about in the biblical books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. One is when God himself writes, or rather engraves, his words on the tablets of the covenant with his finger. The second sacred act of writing is performed by Moses when he, at God's command, writes down God's revealed words. Is that moving?
Oh no, what is it? No?
Yes. Yes.
You too? Yes.
Yes.
So you use this.
Okay. Thank you. For example, in Deuteronomy 31:9 says, Moses wrote down this teaching, that is Torah, and gave it to the priests. Moses is not only a prophet who receives the divine words, he is also their scribe, and thus, as Annette said already yesterday, the very first Torah scribe. We now jump forward to the period after the destruction of the Second Temple to the era of Rabbinic Judaism. Following the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem and the subsequent diaspora of the Jewish community, communal life and religious practice underwent significant changes. The synagogue, as well as the Beit Midrash, became central locations for learning and liturgy, with the Holy Scriptures at their heart, as you have already seen today in the synagogue. The role of the former temple scribe, however, was now filled by professional scribes within the communities. As is particularly evident in the Talmud, the scribes' activities were increasingly being discussed by the religious scholars, as we have already heard also yesterday when Anumei spoke about the parchment making and the rabbinical discussions about it. So, a saying attributed to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, known as Reish Lakish, which was preserved only in the Jerusalem Talmud, had a far-reaching impact over the century. It says, Rabbi Pinchas said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, the Torah, which the Holy One, blessed be He, gave to Moses, He gave him as white fire engraved with black fire, fire wrapped in fire, hewn out of fire, and given by fire. This is what is written, lightning flashing at them from God's right. It is not known whether Reish Lakish himself conceived the idea of the fiery Torah or adopted it from elsewhere. So far, I have not found any other or earlier source in which the Torah is described in this way. Moreover, wherever else in rabbinical literature there is mention of a Torah written or engraved in white and black fire, reference is almost always made to Reish Lakish. So most probably he himself coined this idea of the fiery Torah. The image of the fiery Torah became widely used over time and can be found in many texts of other stories. Oh no, sorry. Annette, I maybe need your help. Der Text läuft hier unten weiter, aber es ist noch nicht gleich die nächste Folie. Okay. Sorry, I'm not a Mac user. So I'm going to mention just a few examples here, whenever else the fiery Torah is mentioned. The motive was taken up both in the Talmud and by later scholars, such as Maimonides, to clarify halachic questions. According to them, thus, anyone who is impure may study and touch the Torah, since the words of the Torah and the Torah itself cannot become impure. For, just as fire does not become ritually impure, so too words or matters of Torah do not become ritually impure. The fiery Torah also appears in the medieval book Zohar, where it is interpreted in a Kabbalistic sense. And moreover, it has also found its way into narrative texts, that is, stories, legends, and myths. And this brings us to the main subject of my lecture. In narrative texts from different regions and different times, we also encounter letters of white and black fire, sometimes detached from any specific reference to the Torah. For example, a Hasidic story from Eastern Europe tells that God wrote his name on the foreheads of the angels, on the forehead of the good angels in white fire, and on the forehead of an evil angels in black fire. Other stories explicitly speak of a heavenly Torah. One such story from ancient Babylon and Palestine describes how, after Adam's fall from paradise, when they ate the fruit, the world was thrown into darkness, but a tiny part of a miraculous divine light was captured by God in a jewel. This jewel was passed down by Adam to his descendants and coming generations until it reached Enoch. It is said that Enoch looked into the jewel and saw a flame transforming into Hebrew letters. By reading these letters, Enoch was also able to read the heavenly Torah, for it was imprinted in the flame of the shining jewel. In this way, Enoch became a sage. He was taken to paradise on a throne chariot, the Merkava, and changed there into the angel Metatron, and has since become the heavenly scribe and prince of heavenly treasures. Let us now read a story in which letters of white and black fire play an important role. It is taken from a work by Rabbi Chaim Vital and entitled Sefer HaChezionot, the Book of Vision. And Chaim Vital lived in the mid-16th century until the early 17th century. It contains Vital's dreams and visions, as well as mystical experiences and messianic thinking. He lived in Palestine and Syria, and he was a rabbi and influential Kabbalist of his time, and himself a follower of the Kabbalistic teachings of, you may know him, the famous Isaac Luria, also known as the Ari. So the story says, on the third yahrzeit of the death of the Ari, you can follow me by reading, so I thought it's easier to follow. So by the third yahrzeit, it means in the third year after the death of the Ari, Rabbi Chaim Vital dreamed that he was home alone reading the Zohar when someone knocked at the door. When he opened it, he saw the Ari. But even in the dream, he remembered that the Ari was no longer among the living, and he understood that if the Ari had come to him from so far away, he must have something very important to tell him. The Ari said, "It was always your desire to see the handwriting of the Messiah," another rhyme. "See, I have brought you a letter in his own hand, a message from the Messiah. Open it." Chaim Vital asked the Ari to swear 3 times that the letter was truly written by the Messiah, so he had some doubt. And this the Ari swore. So Chaim Vital unsealed the letter, and there he saw words written in black fire on white, and the shape of those letters was like those of a Torah scroll. And from those flaming letters he learned that the footsteps of the Messiah would soon be heard in the land of Israel, and that everything must be made ready. When Chaim Vital finished reading, he looked up and saw that the Ari had disappeared. He turned back to the letter, but this time it was written white fire on black. There, in the letters of white fire, the mysteries of the Messiah were revealed. At the moment he read the last word written in white fire, he woke up, and the first thing he saw was a dove, fluttering outside his window with something in his beak that looked like a letter. Then the dove took flight, and he followed it until it disappeared. The next, somewhat longer story takes us to medieval Germany and to one of the greatest Ashkenazi scholars of the time. So, let's move to another country. So, in the city of Worms, there's an ancient Torah inscribed on parchment of deerskin. It is said that this scroll was written by Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg while he was imprisoned. No possession of the Jews who lived there is more precious for its origin was miraculous. Rabbi Meir had been cast into jail, and a huge ransom of 20,000 gold coins had been placed on his head. Nevertheless, the Jews of that generation decided to raise the sum and send a delegation to Rabbi Meir, but he rejected the offer, saying, I regret to deprive you of the mitzvah of redeeming a captive. Still, I prefer to remain a prisoner rather than to encourage this kind of extortion. All I ask is that you bring me tools of a scribe, so that I may write down my thoughts about the Torah. For I have been forbidden to have any books. With no other choice, the delegation respected his wishes, and he received a scribe's quill, ink, and pieces of parchment. So, Rabbi Meir remained imprisoned, and even though he had been deprived of every book, he had long since memorized not only the Torah, but both Talmuds. All that he truly needed was a Torah scroll to read on Shabbat, since it is written that the Torah must be studied on that day from a text. One Friday night, Rabbi Meir fell asleep, and while he slept, his soul took wing and ascended on high. When he opened his eyes, he was blinded by a bright light, but when his eyes grew accustomed to the light, he found himself in a palace chamber, and there was a glowing figure standing before him, an angel. Just then the angel spoke and said, Welcome, Rabbi Meir. I am the angel Gabriel, and you have ascended to my palace. The heavenly hosts are aware of how distressed you are because you lack a Torah scroll. You have been brought here to receive one. This is one of the 13 scrolls that Moses This is one of the 13 scrolls that Moses himself wrote before his death. One scroll was given to each of the 12 tribes, and the 13th was brought to the heavenly academy. This is that Torah. Now it is to remain with you. All that we ask is that you read loud enough that it can be heard here. For the sages on high will be listening to every word, since it is their Torah that you will be reading. When Rabbi Meir opened his eyes, it was the first crack of dawn. He looked around, still in a daze, and it was then that he saw the Torah scroll lying upon the table. Rabbi Meir washed and dressed, staring with amazement at the Torah, and for a long time he did not dare to touch it, lest it all be a dream. When the time came to read the weekly portion, the Torah scroll rolled open to the right place, and as Rabbi Meir began to read, the room filled with a holy light, and he felt the presence of all the tzaddikim on high. He read slowly and clearly, and he read loud enough that not even a single word would be lost. And when he finished reading, the scroll closed on its own, and the light vanished from the room. So it was that Rabbi Meir lived in the presence of that sacred scroll, reading the Shabbat portion from it every week and studying it night and day. During that time, he discovered many truths that could only be discerned by one who read in the celestial scroll. One day it occurred to Rabbi Meir to copy the Torah scroll for the generations to come. Every day he sat at the table transcribing every word from the sacred parchment. He worked on it for 12 months, and at last he completed it without a single error. And when he reread what he had written, he discovered that heaven had assisted him in creating a perfect replica of the celestial Torah. When he awoke the next morning, he discovered that the scroll of Moses was gone, and he knew that Gabriel must have descended that night to take it back. And Rabbi Meir knew that this meant that heaven had found the Torah he had written to be perfect, and that it would now serve as a model for future generations. During the remaining 6 years in prison, he fashioned a wooden ark to hold the Torah scroll and covered it with pitch to make it waterproof. When he felt the end of his life drawing near, he lowered the ark with a scroll inside from his window into the Rhine River. In the days that followed, the ark floated down the river until at last it approached the city of Worms. Some Gentile fishermen tried to catch it in their nets, but it always eluded them. Soon word spread about this elusive box. It became the talk of the city, and many tried their luck at capturing it, but no one succeeded. Among the Jews of the city, there was an intense debate about the box. Some said it had a demon inside, while others insisted that it was being guided by the Holy Spirit, which is why it eluded all the Gentiles. At last, the Jews decided to see if they had any better luck. They rented a boat, and they were quickly able to pull it into the boat. When they returned to shore, however, the owner of the boat, who was not Jewish, claimed the box as his own, since it was caught with his boat. The Jews were forced to give it up. But when the Gentiles tried to lift it, they could not. Even when a dozen men tried to pick it up, they could not. At this they became frightened and ran away. But the Jews had no difficulty in lifting and carrying it into the synagogue, where they opened the box. Inside, they found the Torah scroll, inscribed on deerskin, and along with it was a message, also on parchment, from Rabbi Meir, giving it as a gift to the community of Worms. When the Jews of the city learned of this miracle, they celebrated and gave thanks to God. The Torah remained there for many generations, guarding them from danger and serving as a great blessing in their lives. As for Rabbi Meir, he died in jail soon after he lowered the ark into the river, and his soul ascended directly to Gabriel's palace. There he makes his home in the world to come, serving every Shabbat as a reader of the celestial Torah, kept in the ark on high. Both stories contain many different aspects that would be worth discussing in detail, no doubt. But I want to focus on a few that are here directly related to the writing of the Torah or the Torah itself. A central motive in these two and many other stories concerns dreams. Dreams, their interpretation and questioning play a significant role in Judaism, a prime example being Jacob's dream vision, in which angels also feature prominently. Another theme involves angels as mediators of both divine knowledge and revelations. The angel Gabriel plays an important role in all three monotheistic religions. He first appears in the Bible in the book of Daniel, where he acts as God's messenger. In the Quran, Gabriel or Jibril carries the word of Allah to Muhammad, and in Christianity he announces the birth of Jesus to the Virgin Mary, among other things. And lastly, a heavenly Torah also plays a decisive role in the story of Rabbi Meir. It not only enables Rabbi Meir to make a perfect copy of it, but also performs miracles. This is also a case in a story set in Eastern Europe. It tells of two small Polish towns. One, so all comes together. The inhabitants of one town were very rich, but also very sinful. They had a beautiful synagogue with a very old Torah scroll, the age of which no one knows. Even though the sins of the people were not obvious, God saw them because he looked into their hearts. And even the letters in the Torah scroll shuddered because they were so close to sin in that city. The inhabitants of the other town were very poor and had only a small synagogue. They did not even have a Torah scroll. They saved, and they could not afford neither materials for a scribe, nor did they have the means for having written them. So they saved money with great difficulty and were finally able to pay for a scribe. On the night before the scribe was to begin his work, the letters of the Torah scroll from the other town rose into the air and flew like a flock into the moonlight from the town of the sinners to that of the righteous. The scribe who slept in a room next to the synagogue woke up from a bright light. In amazement, he saw the letters flying through the window, landing on the still empty scroll. There, each letter took its rightful place. The scribe knew immediately that he had witnessed a miracle, for every letter was in its proper place in the Torah, and it was complete. He ran out into the night to tell the residents what had happened. They all gathered in the synagogue and saw the miraculous Torah, which became known as the Torah of the Flying Letters, and was said to possess great healing powers. It was revered and preserved like a treasure, and the miracle was never forgotten in this small Polish town. From stories that focus on Torah scrolls, as those I just presented in short, miraculous writing and divine letters of fire, we now turn our attention to scrolls that actually exist. One of the most famous Torah scrolls, shrouded in numerous stories and legends, takes us to North Africa, to the region of Tasnach in Morocco. Among the Jews of North Africa and Yemen, there is a widespread and deeply rooted tradition of saint veneration. Historical and also imaginary entities are or were venerated as saints during their lifetime or after their death and play a central role in this region. So, due to the emigration of North African and Yemeni Jews from their countries of origin in the last century, part of this tradition of saint veneration has been lost and will be lost. However, one sacred entity is not affected by this, and this is a particular Torah scroll named Sefer Tislit. I don't know whether anyone has ever heard of the Sefer Tislit, so I will tell you about it. It is one of the most famous Torah scrolls of Moroccan Jews. It is considered as a holy object, and many miracles are attributed to it. According to legend, it was once found buried by an Arab and is said to have been written in a different way. Unfortunately, I didn't find any information in which way the writing differed, but this is what has been said. And legend has it that this Torah protects all those who live near it, which is why it was also respected and revered not only by the Moroccan Jews, but also by the Muslims of the area. There are many stories surrounding this Torah, relating to its origins, its power, and its relocation from Morocco to its present home in Ashkelon, Israel. Legend has it that the precious manuscript has been kept in 7 nested chambers that together formed a small building. From there, it was only taken out on special occasions or the holy days. The people who made pilgrimages to the synagogue in Tasnach were always rewarded, but those who were impure and dared to approach the sacred walls were struck with paralysis. A Jewish woman who, in accordance with tradition, was perfectly immaculate, pure, watched over this sanctuary with the Sefer Tislit inside. According to legend, the city was never conquered thanks to this Sefer Tislit, thanks to this Torah scroll. And it is said that the local leader, the Al-Qaid, touched the holy scroll when he went out against the enemy, so that he would be not ever hurt or so he became invulnerable. In return, he sacrificed an ox, grain, and oil every year. Muslims who passed through the town on their travels also left something for the holy scroll and were allowed to kiss the wall of the synagogue. One day, so the story goes, an error was discovered in the sacred text of the scroll. a wise man came and declared that the scroll was no longer suitable for reading and wanted to correct it himself. When he tried, he lost his eyesight. A second man came, and he too failed to correct this error inside the scroll. Then the owner of the scroll said, "Scroll of Tislit, may the one who wrote you correct this word himself." The next day, the word was corrected, like a miracle. There are many different legends about the writer of Sefer Tislit. According to one, he was a Baal Shem Tov, meaning a wise man, who came from ancient Israel. He had only one son, and when war broke out and his son was taken prisoner, he is said to have wrote, "When my son returns, I will write 7 Torah scrolls in holiness and purity." And so it came to pass. His son returned, and he wrote the 7 Torah scrolls, and one of them was the Tislit scroll. According to another legend, it originally came from the temple, and after its destruction was carried across the sea to Morocco. Today, the scroll is kept in a synagogue in Ashkelon and is said to still perform miracles, such as healing the sick. There it is still venerated by Jews of Moroccan origin, and every year a Hilullah, a celebration for saints, is held in its honor. The Sefer Tislit is not the only Torah scroll known to perform miracles in Jewish diaspora. There are other traditions and stories from Libya, Persia, Iraq, Syria, Amsterdam, and, as we have also already heard, also from Worms and Eastern Europe. The many different stories and legends show that the significance of the Torah goes far beyond the text it contains as law and historical testimony. In the imaginations of people, it becomes a sacred entity, a miracle worker, and protective force. The descriptions of a heavenly Torah of Hebrew letters that are a material fire and perform miracles of their own accord are an expression of an expanded interpretation of the Bible, which in some cases even takes on a life of its own. Moreover, the many legends show the great importance attached to writing and scripture, to the scribe, and to the Torah as a sacred object. These narrative sources provide us with an additional perspective and knowledge about the meaning, role, and function of the act of sacred writing and the sacred writings themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana, for this miraculous stories. Yeah, maybe there are some questions or remarks. I was just thinking of, I remember a Bible manuscript, and there you can, from medieval times, I think of 14th century, and there was an image of a group of women standing in front of the Ark of the Torah scrolls, and there were different Torah scrolls, and they were like adoring these Torah scrolls, and scholars thought or interpreted this image as they wish to become pregnant, or maybe the children or from the family members were sick, and they like praying to the Torah scroll for the health of this family members. And it's so it's a common thing in the cultural environment. So in Christian churches, everybody runs into the church in Maria for everything. It's so interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, also this was a new field, like also to learn about the veneration of the shrines of the saints, like rabbis or other people that were lifted up as saints, mostly in this northern African and also in the Yemen area. And people go to their shrines, to the graves, and to have like a Hilullah. But also I found this Sefer Tislit, and there are some others, but less well known. The Sefer Tislit is one of the most cherished one. No, me before I prepared this, and also because I'm usually I deal with other materials, but for me it was really interesting. And all those stories that about the Sefer Tislit that I just comprised, like I took it from different testimonies that are collected, and most of them are actually based on oral history. So you can find them collected by scholars who deal with Yemenite Jewry and also Northern African history. And there I found those scattered in different sources. And then I took them because I was interested in the narrative part to see, wow, this is something, it's another level or another layer for of the scroll itself to. And I heard, just to add, now in Ashkelon, I read a story. There was a woman, and all of a sudden she became sick. And an elderly woman told her, "Okay, go to Sefer Tislit. It will help you." And she became healthy again. So she got kind of I don't know, something with her face happened. So she didn't dare to leave the house because she felt ugly and somehow affected, like in a bad way, like really some kind of a skin disease. And when she went to the Sefer Tislit, she was healed. So this is regarded as one of the healing wonders attributed to this Sefer Tislit. And on YouTube I found a video, so I took the one pictures, so you can see part of the Hilulah, and mostly women are involved also in this kissing the Sefer Tislit. Sorry.
I wonder about this kind of concept that is represented in your paper, as if some specific Torah rolls are holier or more powerful than others. I'm not an expert in Torah rolls in any way, but I do know that Torah rolls are they have to be written or to be in a state where you can still use them for reading, and when you cannot repair them anymore, they are either moved to the Geniza or are buried, and then a new Torah scroll is written. So how controversial is this concept of like prime Torah scrolls? I bet there must be some objection of this entire concept if you ran across anything like that.
It's an interesting point that is visible, especially in the Rabbi Meir story, where it's said that he gets the heavenly Torah, and the heavenly Torah is another motive that appears since rabbinic Judaism. It pops up here and there in different contexts and different genres, different texts. We have it in the Zohar. We have the Torah written in fire as in the concept of Reish Lakish. We have it in halachic discussions, but also in this very narrative materials. And there it is obvious. He copied a perfect Torah from the heavenly Torah, and it's kind of like a Stellvertreter, like a vice president of the heavenly, like the one written by Rabbi Meir, who was also like a great rabbi, one of the greatest of the time. So he copied this marvelous, miraculous Torah scroll, and it protected it. Showed this. Yeah, it's an interesting point actually, and.
Maybe the Torah will be with you. Let the Force be the Star Wars. Maybe the Torah will be with you.
It's actually not a really Jewish thought, I think, and I think the influence from outside. They also thought about icons.
Yes.
Icons,
Kind of
which are
idolatry.
be adored.
Mhm.
It's so
Like
maybe
icons.
something. Yeah.
In Greek, sorry, can I?
Yeah, sure.
I made 2 points. In Greece, there's a famous icon of the Virgin Mary, which apparently performs miracles on the island of Tinos, and a whole shrine's been built on it, and people go people go on their bare knees up to receive the blessings or the holiness of the thing. If people believe it's all well and good, but yeah. It's,
Exactly.
and there's another, in the Orthodox and Ottoman world, there are lots of shrines. For
Yes.
example, on the island of Pringipos in Istanbul, there is a church to St. George, and Muslims go and pray there as well on the feast day of St. George.
Yes.
So there's all this kind of syncretism going on. And one Jewish case, sorry, I talk a lot. On the island of Chios, there was once upon a time a grave which was believed to be the grave of the German rabbi, the medieval rabbi, Jacob ben Asher. And as far as we have normal sources which tell us he was buried in Spain, but for some reason a legend developed, and people would go and pray there and go on pilgrimage for many hundreds of years. And after the Second World War, the community was stopped, or it no longer existed. And apparently that grave was moved to Israel. I don't know
I think
what happened to it, but
Sorry, there are a lot of cases. The people pilgrim to Sfat, to the graves of Ali and all this.
Yes, including in Morocco also.
Und jeder hatte eine Richtung, einer für Kaffee, für bring when together, the other for sickness, the other.
But people go, they go to the Lubavitcher.
Yes, of course. This is modern, but it's the same.
This huge
It's the same,
lines.
of course.
But it's interesting. So I haven't found any more research about it. So I just, by looking for the motive of Torah cards, I found all those legends. I was like, but just to collect what Asaf said, I was thinking when I transcribed the story of Rabbi Meir, I was like, is it somehow connected to Rabbi Meir? Is he like a special scribe? What's the role of the scribe in this sense? What makes a Torah more venerable? And then the case of the Sefer Tisli, that even Muslims come there. It was like Adi, it was normal to go there to kiss it, to sacrifice. Like the leader, the Muslim leader of the town, Tasnaf, of the region, he sacrificed every year an ox, grain, and oil in order to protect, and it was never captured. So there's a lot of legend, and it's kind of, and I wonder what's the difference between saint veneration as a person, like somebody who did, and object veneration. And here the lines got a little bit blurry. It's really interesting also for our questions of what makes an object actually holy or sacred. So yeah, there was another question. Do we have time for?
Maybe one question?
Just a comment. I say it with 20 minutes, but I'm not a scholar. But I think maybe you were referring, there are holy places according to Ashkenazic Hasidic custom in New York, and I've had the privilege, I think, of visiting Rabbi Schneerson's grave, and on 10 Shvat, they were celebrating his death, and when you go to, I think it depends also on your faith, and the materiality though of the importance of paper and letters and parchment in the Jewish religion is so strong there, and you enter and you go to his gravesite, to the Rebbe's Ohel, and you pray or you mourn or you ask, but before you go in, there are tables, long tables, and you sit and you write what you want to say to the rabbi, then you tear it up, and you must believe that his soul or Hashem, somebody will receive these letters and answer you. And I've had this experience only a handful of times, but it's incredibly powerful if you're open to it. But this that you have to write it. It's not like going and just to pray from your heart. It's the paper and the letters. The emphasis is to see the letters go up.
Just one final sentence taking up. was only like a small choice because of our time frame, but I found so many stories, legend tales, dealing with parchment, also letters, writing, the flying letters flying to our heavenly to our scribes. So there's a lot of going on actually this subject, or what's isn't especially interesting to us, like the writing, the materiality, and the letters, flying letters, coming miraculously from one town to the another. No, and we don't want to stay with the sinners. We go to the writers one, and then they fly. I saw so many flying letters in those tales from different regions. This is kind of a common thread, reaching from Eastern Europe to all the areas back to Baghdad, and this is really interesting to see like this narrative material. So I think
We should call it.
yes, we should. Jasmine. So if anyone wants to know more sources, I'm happy
send it
to.
to us.
Yes.
So thank you. So now we are going from miraculous legends to real history, I guess, in our last three presentations, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Marcelo Benveniste, who is also the co-organizer of this workshop. Shall we? Yeah, you do it. So I'm very delighted to introduce to you Marcelo, a scholar and cultural advocate whose lifelong dedication to Sephardic heritage has made him a central figure in preserving and promoting the history, language, and tradition of Sephardic communities worldwide. As co-founder and editor of eSefarat, Noticias del Mundo Sefaradi, and a long-standing collaborator with the Centro Cultural Sefarat, together with his wife Liliana in Buenos Aires, Marcelo has built bridges between scholarship, cultural preservation, and public engagement. Drawing on his deep personal connection, his own grandparents are from this island. This morning we found the houses of his grandparents. Marcelo brings both scholarly insight and lived experience to his work. So in his today lecture, Marcelo will guide us through the migration history of the Jewish community of Rhodes and Kos to Argentina, illuminating the journeys, challenges, and enduring cultural legacy of these communities. So, can I help you?
Yes, yes.
Where's my...
Yeah.
Ah, you're close?
Yeah. No, it's open in the
That's okay. So welcome.
Thank you. You know, my English is not very good. In fact, it's bad. But I will do my best. The last week I practiced this lecture. Let's see what happened. Okay. Yes. Yeah, right. I want to begin by thanking the Jewish community of Rhodes, its president Claudia Restis, and especially Carmen Cohen, to whom we are deeply grateful for the important work they do. And also Bella Retis, whom I remember fondly from our meetings, including one in Buenos Aires. I apologize, Claudia, I don't have a photo with you. This is the first time we met. I hope the next time I will put a picture with you. I also want to thank the Free University and the Federal Ministry of Research, Technology and Space, which made this meeting possible, both from the Federal Republic of Germany. I would also include in this acknowledgement Aaron Hasson, my friend, who has been and continues to be a very important figure for us, what we might call the Jewish community of Rhodes in exile, with the descendants, and who also contribute some of the image I will be using here. And thank you, Annette, for your trust and for the love with which you embrace the history of the Jews of Rhodes, allowing me to join you at this event. Since the island of Rhodes has become a tourist destination in ever-increasing numbers every year, there were 60,000 last year, in addition to 5,000 people who came on holiday. Since among these privileged people who can visit the enchanting island, there are certainly some Jews we thought it interesting to publish some brief historical information on the past and present of this latter resident of Rhodes. This was written by an advisor to the governor in this booklet, Alcuni Ceni Sorici Sulieprei di Rodi, in 1936. Not only speak English, also Italian. This was the prevailing view at the time, even though the population was already declining. Indeed, in that year, 1936, there were 45 Jews on the island of Rhodes, whereas 30 years earlier, there had been 6,000. The fall of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 20th century and the difficulties already present in Europe with the First World War and other conflicts led to the exodus to North and South America, the Belgian Congo, Southern Africa, and some other European countries. It is not the purpose of this space to discuss the origin of the Jewish presence in Rhodes, although we will provide a brief overview from its beginning to the 20th century before addressing to the specific topic of the migration to Argentina. The existence of a Jewish colony on the island is already mentioned in the Book of Maccabees, although we take as the first documented reference the writings of Benjamin of Tudela about his travels, which recognized the presence on the island by the year 1166, identifying 500 Jews there. Voltaire Mesulam, in this chronicle of his journey to Palestine in 1481, recounts the presence of Abraham de Ferrara, the notables Messer Leon de Rodi, and the Dr. Azaria, who suffered the consequences of the siege by the Turks a year earlier, which destroyed a good part of the Jewish quarter. Rabbi Obadiah de Bertinoro writes in a letter 1488 about his visit to the island and details the Jewish community of that time, but due to the passage of time, I won't read it now. The story continues with moment of peace and moment of war until 1522, when, after the conquest of Rhodes by Sultan Suleiman, many Jews emigrants or children of those who were expelled from Spain in 1482 came from various cities in Turkey to settle in Rhodes, significantly increasing the number of Jews and forming the majority of the community. Therefore, the customs and even the Spanish language of these Jews prevailed over those of the natives with their own customs and who surely spoke Greek. The 40 families that Sultan Suleiman transplanted from Saloniki had a great influence. Of course, you know this image. which shows the route taken by the Jews expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. And as is clear, they did not go directly to Rhodes until 1522. During the following 390 years, between 1522 and 1912 of Ottoman rule, Jews lived in peace, like all other religionists in the empire of the Sultan. However, the difficulties that, as we mentioned, has already arisen since the end of the 19th century led to the beginning of migration from Rhodes to Argentina. The anterior. La 10. Esta. I saw Argentina, although the story will be very similar for other countries, especially those mentioned earlier, like United States, Belgium, Congo, South Africa, and other European countries like Belgium. No sé. When they then have the first of the three mass migration, that of the first quarter of the 20th century. Let me say it is in this way that my grandparents, Elias, Rebecca, Asher, and Leonor came. We do not at the moment who the first immigrant from Rhodes was. That is, when and why Argentina was chosen by the Rhodes list is currently under investigation. We can only say that Argentina was then a country that recognized growth potential and far removed from European conflicts. A country that had jobs, food, and peace. It was called the breadbasket of the world. El granero del mundo, is in Spanish. The graph shows the growth trends in several times, as you can see on the left, in violet or blue, the first column, identifying that Argentina's potential was very high, far exceeding that the European countries, although of course the history will later tell a different story. That's why we thought Argentina was one of the first options to emigrate. The first wave lacked a particular organizational structure, rather it developed as a relative call on their close and distant family members. On the island of Rhodes, families often used their last remaining money to send a son to develop far from Europe, hoping he would eventually become the spearhead for others to follow. Let's move on then to the second wave, the second mass migration, which will be much more organized. We were talking at the beginning about the prosperity the community enjoyed in 1936, as Vital Strunzan described in his book. Unlike Dimitri today told us. In those times, in the Jewish quarter of Rhodes, there were two synagogues, the Kal Gadol from the time of the Knights, from the year 1481, and the Kal Shalom from 1593, restored in 1840. In addition of these great synagogues, there were in the same Jewish quarter 4 midrashim. The streets of the neighborhood were like the courtyard of a single house. At one time, there were many yeshivot containing hundreds of religious books, but in 1936, only one remained belonging to the Menashe family. The community had a school attended by approximately 450 students for both sexes, and a rabbinical boarding school founded in 1922 that trained rabbis and educators from all over the world, many of whom went on to lead distinguished community worldwide. A decree for the governor mandates the observance of Shabbat on Saturdays, just as it does on Sundays and Fridays for followers of other faiths. Strunza says, in the midst of the vast ocean of modern life, where the ship of religion threatens to sink and where religion is continually and inexorably losing ground and strength, Rose appeared as a bright spot, a rare refuge for Jewish religion and tradition in danger. But when Benito Mussolini decreed the racial laws in Italy, things got ugly. Not immediately. In the first step that in 1936, there were a change of Governor Mario Lago left and Cesare Maria De Vecchi took over. And in 1938, Italian-Russian laws were strongly enforced in the Dodecanese island, along with a series of decrees that aligned local legislation with Italian law. This is what begins what we call the Second Exodus. Let's see what's happening in Argentina. In this time, Buenos Aires had already established its Jewish Rhodes Lee community in 1929, with its own prayer spaces and essential community activities, such as caring of the sick, supporting the poor, tending to the dead, and studying the Talmud Torah. The Centro Cultural and Recreativo Israelita Shalom was already functioning as a second Rhodes in exile. Fabian Shoai will discuss the details of this institution, which is approaching to the 100th anniversary later. At that time, some prominent figures from Rhodes has already prospered, and letters from Buenos Aires to Rhodes were multiplying enthusiastically, inviting them to leave the island and join their family far from the countries threatening Europe. This is the letter where the community informed to the rest of the institution that the foundation of the community, in fact, this is November 1929 when the Shalom was founded, and you will see this is one the house that today we discovered. This is my grandfather, the vice president, and this is the other, the Hotel Cavadoro, my two grandparents. There were difficulties. Argentina had issued the circular number 11, which effectively barred Jews from entering the country. It literally stated that it prohibits entry to the country to any person who is reasonably considered to have left their country as an undesirable or expelled person, whatever the reason for their expulsion was. Despite this connection of some community members allowed them to pull off this rescue operation. This was the case with Moise Chami, who has built a significant textile company, giving him access to financial resources and especially connection with the government in power. His activity concerning aid to immigrants were carried out by this secretary, Salvador Tarica. What we see in the image below his photos are the plaques in his honor at the Shalom Synagogue in Buenos Aires. The community came together to raise money and, in particular, to use their important relationship with government figures at the time to achieve their goal. Let's look at a couple of emblematic cases that I will tell you about. Two cases that will be emblematic to show the process. Excuse me, take transport. I hope you understand the La próxima. This was Mardocheo Menashe, wrote from the island of Kos. You know, the island of Kos is very close from here. On February 28, 1939. The letter is in Ladino. Due to the time constraint, I will only read you a few excerpts. This is the... Pasa al anterior. Okay. This is the original. Un antes. Ahí está. This is the original in a mix with Ladino, Spanish, something of Italian. We are talking in 1939. And now this is the translation in English. I will read some excerpt. Dear and esteemed cousin Moise. Moise is Moise Chami, of course. I can send to you a copy. It is pointless for me to distress you and tell you all the bad things which Jews are going through at the hands of the Italian. I won't tell you anything about this, knowing that you are surely aware of everything. As a consequence of the Italian racial laws, I was forced to liquidate my business and decided to leave this line under Italian control. I know of your kind and immense generosity. I also know of your influence in your country. This is why I dare to appeal to your feelings and ask for your help in this moment of great despair into which I have fallen. I beg you, through the means at your disposal, to arrange for me to enter Argentina with my wife, my 3 young children, and my mother-in-law. I don't want any material help from you. Esto es el padre de Pepe Menashe. Mardocheo Menashe. I'm sure you won't fail to take care of this immediately before things get even worse. Even day brings more bitterness for the Jews here. I went to save my 3 children. The Menashe family arrived in Buenos Aires 1 year later, after living in various cities in Chile. They had visa to Bolivia, but endured countless hardship to travel to Argentina, where their family lived. Throughout their journey, they wrote many desperate letters. I have these letters, describing their children going hungry, their enduring finances, and how they survive on money sent by the Jewish community in Buenos Aires through their Chilean counterparts. Finally, after almost a year, they arrived in Buenos Aires and lived happily with their family, as you can see in the picture. Let's see another case. The other case I'm going to talk about is that of Abner Notrica family, who belong to the affluent sector of the Rhodes community and were actively involved in various local community organizations. Their ancestors had been on the island for over 200 years. In early 1939, Abner Notrica received a telegram from Moise Chamy, his wife's uncle, advising him to leave the country as soon as possible. The telegram also included the name of 29 other people who will be traveling with him and asking him to handle the necessary paperwork in Rhodes, thanks to his good relations with the police. Chamy, in turn, will do the same in Argentina to secure the entry into the country. Thanks to this connection, the group departed without major difficulties, including Mr. and Mrs. Notrica and their son, for Venice, Milan, Genoa, where the Argentine consul was to stamp their passport, obtaining the transit visa so they could continue their journey. Upon initiating the process, they discovered that the consul refused to grant the visas, claiming he sent their information to remain permanently in Argentina. They immediately telegraphed Buenos Aires, informing them to the difficulty. In Buenos Aires, Salvador Tarica personally sent a telegram to the Minister of Migration, who, in response, telegraphed directly to the consul in Genoa, ordering him to grant the visas immediately. The response arrived a few hours before the scheduled departure of the steamship Conte Grande on which the group was to travel. The passport were stamped after their deposit the necessary funds to guarantee the purchase of the passage from Buenos Aires to Bolivia, and they boarded a few minutes before the ship sailed. It was March 1939. While the ship sailed, preparations were made in Buenos Aires. Mr. Chamy and the minister agreed to send their secretaries to Montevideo to await the ship where they boarded. During the voyage to Buenos Aires, they took the necessary steps to ensure the group's disembarkation in Buenos Aires. Having established a rapport with the ship's purser, Abner Notrica approached him and retrieved the money for the transfer to Bolivia, which had been deposited with the consul in Genoa and which the purser was carrying. The purser accepted and handed over the seal envelope containing the money. On April 8, 1939, the ship arrived at the port of Buenos Aires. They disembarked, their luggage was checked, and they were able to leave without difficulty. They were met to ministry official and by a ministry official and by Moise Chamy, who had arrived early to speak with the authorities. A few days later, the minister sent an order to Chamy, instructing the newcomers to report as soon as possible to the police department, where there will be issued identity document. Once settled, Abner Notrica actively participated in the institutional work of the Shalom community and dedicated his time to helping Jews affected by World War II. This is the list of part of the list of passengers, where is the Notrica and other person like Jaime Barro is other member of the community. This is the group that came. Diego Levy is Abner Jason Notrica. Abner Notrica, grandson, is here, and he doesn't know that I will talk about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So today you saw the kippah from Abner Notrica. This is Abner Notrica's kippah.
These two cases serve as examples of the difficulties encountered, but especially the solidarity of the Rodeseli community in Argentina, which facilitated this second very large wave of immigration, always centered around the Shalom community of Buenos Aires. This member, Rodeselis and descendant of the first wave, not only took pity on their relatives, facilitating their new life in America, but also collaborated with those who remained in Rhodes in the face of the difficulties posed by racial laws in the looming Second World War. Here you can see a message from the Shalom community in Buenos Aires to the president of the Jewish community of Rhodes, remitting funds for various institutions of the Jewish community on Rhodes. Let's see, this is in Spanish. Let's see the translation in English. Of course, I can send the scan in there for all that. In the interest of time, I won't read them, but in short, in this case, they are sending money raised during the Yom Kippur ceremonies to the Israeli schools and the rabbinical seminary, and it concludes by expressing the feeling of solidarity and animates all the Rhodesli who live in this latitude, grouped around the Centro Cultural Israelita Shalom. And finally, we have to talk about the third wave. Small, unfortunately, we cannot talk about mass migration, and it is the arrival of the survivors. Very few indeed. Only a handful of Holocaust survivors found in their relative already in Argentina the possibility of rebuilding their lives. Among them, David Galante, Lili Soriano, Denise Menashe, and others. It took them many years before they began to speak. They carried in their bodies and minds the wounds inflicted during the terrible moments they lived through in the extermination camps, watching their parents, their siblings, their neighbor die. Clearly, the purpose of this meeting is not to delve into the subject of the Holocaust, which deserves a separate discussion. Many of us are committed to remembering and keeping the memory alive, especially in those times when these survivors are no longer with us and so few remain. The Shalom community, the Shalom community, the Centro Cultural Sefarad of Buenos Aires that I preside over, and the Holocaust Museum of Buenos Aires jointly hold an annual commemoration and tribute to the victims and survivors of the Shoah from the Sephardic community of Rhodes, Saloniki, and Kos. This is our commitment. But I especially mention David Galante, de Bendicha Memoria, who only began speaking about the issue in 1994 and who committed himself to bearing witness and very possible forum, both within Jewish context and especially outside of them in public institutions such as school and law enforcement agency. Having toured the Jewish quarter of Rhodes with him in 2008 was a blessing for me. This has been a summary of the legacy of the Jewish community of Rhodes in Argentina, surely not very different from those of other cities, although with the vicissitudes inherent of each of those metropolises. Recently, documentation has emerged regarding the migration process from Rhodes to Argentina, and as I dedicate myself to this research, I hope to be able to publish a book that documented this story, maybe in next times. Many of us descendants are committed with this history, and it is not just a matter of honor. We have made this cause the purpose of our very life. In fact, the story will continue to be written. And finally, just a comment as Annette told, Eliane and me have an institution, the Centro Cultural Sefarad, and the ARM electronic, the esefarad.com, with all the social and there is a hyperlink with all the things we are doing, especially in our YouTube channel. We have more than 1,000 videos. Most of them, 250 more or less, are only in Ladino, and I don't know, 500 in Spanish, or lectures from all around the world. It's a very big videotheque. I invite you to access to these networks. And nothing else. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Marcelo. Are there any questions or remarks? Asa?
I have
Yes, of course. If not, I say not.
It's a question maybe not just for you, but for other people who are who are dedicating so much time and effort to the commemoration and the research. Most of the people here belong to a generation that still grew up with people who actually came from Rhodes. And I kind of wonder what should the next step be for future generations, and this goes to both sides of the aisle. Like what do you think your needs are, and what can the museum and the great work that they have been already doing
This is
to the next.
This is a challenge. Especially I will talk about in Argentina. Argentina has the problem that have every country, but worst. The economical crisis, the South America is very far from all the world. The challenge is very heavy. The Shalom community make this act yearly in honor of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, and other activities during the year. And we, from the Centro Cultural Sefarad, also make, we give 2 lectures weekly. One in Spanish and one full in Ladino. And the Rhodes, the history of the Jews of Rhodes is always over the table, always. In fact, the activity that we have on Sundays, that is only in Ladino, there is many descendants of the Rhodes list that talk about the history, relating what their parents, relating to them, etc. It's always on, but it's a challenge. Of course, the event to the remembrance of the Holocaust yearly, of course, each year is less people to come. But you need an extra effort to relieve the event, because I'm talking about the marketing acts in order to phone all the embassies to come here, and the descendant and the second and third generation to come, because it's not easy. It's not easy. It's very hard, very, very heavy. But it's the challenge. The only thing that we don't do is to abandon. We never not. I told that. I think it's the same, but for them, it's the same for the community here or for the activity. If you know the activities that Aaron has, he's programming the next 2 years to show the history of Jewish around the United States.
I'm curious, is Ladino being taught anywhere?
Yes, it's not too much. There are only a few people that speak Ladino as a maternal language. But after the COVID, when the electronic communication growth was an impulse for the language. In fact, there are many institutions that give courses of Ladino, including us. Liliana is teach Ladino. You see some Ladino. There are many singers that are singing Ladino. Not all the singers are committed with the language. It's a sympathetic thing, but we make the effort to. We know that in many years nobody will speak Ladino because there is no country or place where you must speak Ladino. That's why Liliana started the Encontros de Aljade. Encontros de Aljade in Ladino means the meeting of Sunday, where the only rule is to speak Ladino. You can speak about the football or the weather or the history of survival, whatever. But you must speak in Ladino. There are people that speak better, others not better.
We have now cafés alegres.
Now, once a month, we have Cafés Alegres, happy coffee, in our Centro Cultural in Presence, where we talk in Ladino. The last month, 12 persons to talk about nothing. To talk about nothing. If you come to Argentina, you can. Masitas, café turco y purequitas.
You're invited. When you come to Argentina, come to Cafés Alegres.
Nothing else?
I have a question.
Yeah, yes.
Maybe to you or to Claudia. I wonder, or can you tell me, was it the largest group who immigrated to Argentina? And I know that another group migrates to Congo and South Africa.
I don't know.
And the second question is the Jews in South Africa from Rhodes. Are they also such a strong Sephardic
connection? There is a synagogue in Cape Town that was founded by Rhodes. First, they went to the Congo, and then in the 60s, they wrote.
Can you say how many percent of the?
Yeah, some went to Brussels because it was a Belgian colony.
Yes.
And I can't really say the percentage, you know, like how many left for Congo and for South Africa. But in Cape Town, it was actually a really big community. A lot of them immigrated. There's still a lot. There's still a lot. And the synagogue still, you can still go on the website and they say you were founded by
If you go to Seattle or Atlanta or Los Angeles, I went to Seattle and the Ezra Bizarrot synagogue. You see the names are this one, it's the same. They are yes.
In Seattle.
The Rodrigo Común?
Yes.
The copy of the Holocaust Memorial.
Yes, they have, yes. Yes.
Because I sent them the plan.
Yes, I saw it. I saw it. Yes. Yes.
Well, I think in the States, I think now it's pretty well organized, I find it. The Jewish Brotherhood, it's really well organized and
Yes.
they do events all over the States.
They have
and
money.
a lot of young people are now taking over, the 20s and 30s. So that, I find it very encouraging. And they do events all over. There's, 5-6 Sephardic synagogues probably connected. So like in Atlanta, a couple in New York, in LA, Seattle. So they do events all over. And they're much better. I mean, they're quite well organized now.
Yes. There are too much people, and they are have heavy position, a good position. This is when I see how Aaron recollect money to do things, I have a jealous of that because it's an advantage.
5 Latino lessons. A lot of events. Galas.
Yes, sure.
The Jewish Brotherhood.
Huerquitas party.
Las burrequitas patas de camp, el Sephardic camp, also. Sí, Sephardic camp, sí.
They do tours every year.
Tours.
Young professionals.
Aaron made picnics. Aaron made picnics. Picnics, you also a picture here of the picnics that the Jewish made here. He copied the idea in Los Angeles.
In Atlanta, they meet every week and they prepare food,
Yes.
which they sell.
Yes.
And I was there.
Yes,
I
sure.
went one day and I
Yes.
was making
Yes.
bad ones.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And you see these old ladies.
Yes.
And there's some, we're born here. Now,
The last.
there's very few people alive
Sure.
that were born on the island.
And some of them came back to Rhodes and started a new life to
No, very visit. They got a couple. Sovianic came back, and who else came back after the war?
But here the community make an event each year in July to remember and honor the victim of the Holocaust. On July each year, the last one was the 81st. It's a big event. Many people come from Belgium, from United States, and other. Yes. How many people come?
The big one was
last year,
The seven.
the 70 years, 500 people.
Okay.
Wow. And then the second 350 and
last year
75.
not so. But they were deported on the 23rd, so we have an event around that date.
Thank you.
We have a presentation. Yes, I have.
Wow, you're so good prepared.
Super. Oh wow, perfect. So I have to do nothing. No. How do you feel? I think I need this one. No. The presentation is here. Ah, okay, super. No. I prepared everything. Oh wow. Alberto.
This is a short for help.
Okay. ¿Sabes cómo acá?
No.
Ready?
PowerPoint no.
Ya lo puse.
Por eso. por la boca.
No,
Un cuerpo
sí.
de común.
Cuando estés acá, solamente la flecha para allá y para acá te trae la siguiente.
Para la atrás.
Claro, la siguiente es acá, te
Y
la cual.
la vos ves lo
No, pero la que no sabes.
pero vos ves acá.
Acá es lo que sigue. Esto es lo que está en
Ah,
pantalla.
esto está en pantalla, esto es lo que sigue.
Esto es lo que sigue. No te dirá así, si quieres volver, pues. Y si no, vuelvo yo.
Vale, esto es lo que hay, esto es lo que sigue.
Esto es lo que sigue. Lo que va
Y yo creo que esto, le debo la esto, digamos.
En esta sí, esta es la que tiene problema.
¿Cuál? Ah,
No
esta.
tuve problema. Lo que tiene problema es que murió el mouse. Lo tuve que hacer. El texto vive sobre entonces, en algún momento de la flecha, So, this is your bank account?
This is my brother. This is the artist name. I listen to you. Or you the wise.
Thank you, and speaking caution so you can share with me.
Thank you.
No, thank you to make this long journey. Thank you so much. Yes. Yes, a very special holiday.
Okay.
So
Quiero pensar que las cartas todavía no existen, pero entonces el cambio aparece en su momento de la carta del centro, ya no. Decime que todavía está. Bueno, ¿te acuerdas que en un tiempo una aula estaba tirando un montón de cartas que son que yo, bueno, que yo las escaneé que son estas, que es un trabajo que había pedido Adriana Broski, que te hizo una donación por eso. Y de ahí estas son importantes, pero al final debería estar ahí. Poco. Es el trabajo de dirección de servicio. Ahí dice que vamos a hablar de la comunidad, solo de la
and this is for you and from Berlin. Very nice chocolate. They hope you enjoy. Yes.
Okay. It works, not in easy to work.
Sorry.
My family house.
Sign de divorcio.
Sign the divorce?
De divorcio, de divorcio.
Yes.
There are a lot of people who buy and sell by themselves. It's actually
Here, we were trying 5 hours. Not your 24
No, this is the cultural center. My question.
Oh, thank you.
Das wollte nicht. Das muss man noch.
En Großbuchstaben, ja, mach das so, dass jeder das durchguckt. Esto con la falda. So, hello. Maybe we should start our last session. Yes, that's the best. Maybe we should start our last session because
Where's Fabia?
So now I'm pleased to introduce you Fabian. I'm very pleased to introduce you, Fabian. Yochai, respected community leader and dedicated voice of Sephardic history and memory in Buenos Aires. As president of the Centro Comunitario Shalom, an institution founded by Jewish immigrants from Rhodes and other Iberian communities that has been an anchor of Sephardic life since the early 20th century. Fabian embodies a deep commitment to cultural continuity and communal remembrance. Under his guidance, the Centro Comunitario Shalom has been at the forefront of commemorating pivotal moments in Sephardic history, including solemn remembrances of the deportations and losses suffered by the Sephardic communities of Rhodes, Kos, and beyond during the Shoah. In such events, Fabian has articulated the enduring legacy of his community, emphasizing the importance of memory, identity, and collective resilience. Today, we will speak about the Sephardic community in Buenos Aires. The lecture will be given in Spanish, and I think we have already a translation of this lecture into English. So, please, it's your stage.
Buenas tardes a todos. Es un verdadero honor estar aquí y también saludar a quienes nos acompañan a través de streaming de distintos rincones del mundo. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer a Jem, que nos permitió llegar a este momento, y especialmente a mi familia, mi papá Alberto, mi esposa Vanessa y mis hijas Melina, Diana y Sabrina. Quiero agradecer a la comunidad judía de Rodas, a su presidente Claudia Restis, a Carmen Cohen, de quienes estamos profundamente agradecidos por la importante labor que hacen. Y también a Bela Restis, que recordamos con mucho cariño su paso por Moreira. Agradecer a la Free University y a la Federal Ministry of Research, Technology and Space que hicieron posible este encuentro, ambas instituciones de Alemania. Y por último, agradecer a Arlene Martini y a Marcelo del Benite, quienes organizaron este hermoso encuentro. Estamos hoy acá porque nos convoca algo más fuerte que la historia. Nos convoca la memoria viva. La memoria del pueblo que cruzó mares y siglos, llevando consigo su fe, su lengua, sus canciones y sobre todo su luz. Hoy quiero compartir con ustedes tres momentos de esa historia. Primero, una mirada general sobre la inmigración judía a la Argentina. Luego, un viaje a las raíces de la inmigración sefaradí. Y finalmente, la historia entrañable de la comunidad Shalom de Buenos Aires, fundada por Rodríguez el 2 de noviembre de 1929. La inmigración judía de la Argentina. A fines del siglo XIX, la Argentina era un país joven, con los brazos abiertos a los inmigrantes. Venían de Europa, del Medio Oriente, del Mediterráneo, buscando trabajo, libertad y un futuro en paz. Entre ellos llegaron los primeros judíos. Algunos venían de Rusia, Polonia, Ucrania, que eran los Ashkenazim. Otros de Turquía, Siria, Grecia, Marruecos, eran los sefaradíes. La Asociación de Colonización Judía, creada por el barón Maurice Hirsch, ayudó a muchos judíos de Rusia y del este europeo a establecerse en colonias agrícolas. Moisés Gil, Basadil Basso, Mauricio, Avídor y tantas otras. Vivían con esfuerzo, con esperanza, con los pies llenos de barro y el corazón lleno de fe. Rezaban bajo techos de chapa, cantaban en hebreo, en yiddish, en ladino. Y así poco a poco la comunidad judía argentina fue creciendo, diversa y viva, unida en la búsqueda de la libertad. Pero dentro de esa gran historia hay una historia más antigua, más sonora, más llena de nostalgia, la historia sefaradí. Decir sefarad es decir España, pero también es decir exilio. En 1492 los judíos son expulsados de la península ibérica, pero lejos de apagarse, esa llama cultural y espiritual se enciende de nuevo en otros puertos. Rodas, Esmirna, Salónica, Estambul, Alepo, Damasco, Marruecos. Allí, en esas tierras del Mediterráneo, floreció una cultura llena de belleza. Una cultura que conservó su idioma, el ladino o judío español. Esa lengua dulce y antigua que uno cuando la oímos nos hace sonreír. El ladino no es solo un idioma, es una manera de sentir, es el idioma de nuestras abuelas, es el idioma de las canciones, de las canciones, de los consejos, de los cuentos. Cuando los sefaradíes se embarcaron hacia la Argentina, trajeron en sus valijas no solo ropa y documentos, trajeron memoria, trajeron el sonido del mar de Rodas, el perfume de las calles de Esmirna, el eco de las plegarias de Damasco. La Argentina de entonces era un país joven, abierto a la inmigración. Buenos Aires ofrecía trabajo, pero no ofrecía identidad. Esa identidad hubo que reconstruirla. Y los sefaradíes supieron cómo hacerlo. Primero el Minyan, luego la sinagoga, después la sociedad de ayuda mutua, el cementerio, la escuela, el club, la calidad. Así nacieron las instituciones sefaradíes. No solo como lujo, sino como necesidad existencial. Los judíos provenientes del Imperio Otomano, de Rodas, Salónica, Esmirna, Estambul, eran mayormente ladinoparlantes. En Buenos Aires se concentraron en barrios como Villa Crespo y Almagro. En 1914 fundaron la comunidad sefaradí de Buenos Aires. una de las instituciones madres del sefaradismo argentino. Allí el ladino era lengua viva, la liturgia conservaba el tono otomano y la comunidad se organizaba con una mirada amplia: culto, cultura, educación y representación colectiva. El templo emblemático de esa corriente es la sinagoga de la calle Camargo, cuya consolidación se dio en 1919. En paralelo llegó una inmigración sefaradí distinta en su carácter. Los judíos de Siria, especialmente de Damasco, se asentaron en el barrio de Oeste, cerca del trabajo, del comercio, y allí se organizaba una comunidad muy cohesionada, profundamente tradicional, centrada en la sinagoga en la calle Lavalle. Esta representación damascena se consolidó como uno de los núcleos más antiguos del judaísmo en la Argentina. Su fortaleza no estuvo en grandes edificios ni clubes, sino en la continuidad religiosa, en la autoridad rabínica y en la vida familiar. Más adelante, otros grupos damascenos fundaron instituciones con un perfil más social y comunitario, como Abogato Didi en Flores en 1913 y Ortorá en Barracas en 1920, ampliando la presencia siria en la Argentina. También llegaron judíos de Marruecos, con sus propios nusas y tradiciones. En 1919 fundaron en Buenos Aires la Congregación Israelí Latina, conocida hoy como Asilva, con su histórico templo en la calle Piedras. Y así en la Argentina sefaradí no hay una sola comunidad, sino varias, cada una con su estilo, unas más litúrgicas, otras más culturales, unas más cerradas, otras más abiertas, pero todas unidas por una misma raíz, sefarada. Comunidades que nunca olvidaron de dónde venían, porque Rodas, Esmirna, Alepo o Tetuán no eran solo lugares, eran parte del alma. Y así, en medio de este recorrido, llegamos al corazón de nuestra historia, la comunidad Shalom de Buenos Aires, fundada el 2 de noviembre de 1929 por un grupo de judíos oriundos de Rodas. Al-Jadef, Cohen, Chami, Benítez, Franco, Levi, Tarica, Joay, familias que eligieron volver a vivir en comunidad. Nuestras familias que eligieron volver a vivir. En los primeros años del siglo XIX, estas familias oriundas de Rodas se asentaron en la zona del puerto de Buenos Aires, para luego instalarse en lo que terminó siendo las Rodas de Buenos Aires, en el barrio de Colegiales. En 1929 comenzaron a reunirse familias provenientes de Rodas, Salónica y Cos, primero en casas particulares y después de mucho esfuerzo, en 1937 inauguraron la sinagoga Shalom, en el barrio de Colegiales. Shalom no era solo un templo, era memoria rodillo organizada. Shalom, allí se preservaron los acentos, las melodías, las comidas, las historias familiares. Su arquitectura moderna y luminosa expresa algo profundo, la voluntad de permanecer sefaradíes sin dejar de ser argentinos. Eran hombres y mujeres que habían cruzado el mar buscando un nuevo comienzo. Buenos Aires crecía y era una ciudad de puerto, de luces, de mezclas. Y en medio de esa gran ciudad, estos rodalíes quisieron conservar su forma de vivir judaísmo, su acento, su música, su fe. Y es así que nuestras familias, aquellas que cruzaron el océano buscando una mejor vida en los primeros años del siglo pasado, lograron congregarse y fundaron una Keilah, o Kaal, como ellos lo llamaban en Rodas. En 1929 quedó conformada la flamante comunidad Shalom, el mismo nombre de una de las comunidades que habían dejado atrás en la isla. El objetivo era cubrir las necesidades de vivir congregados y compartir las celebraciones de la vida judía, disfrutando de las alegrías y compartiendo los momentos difíciles en compañía de otros propios, así como seguir disfrutando del acervo cultural sefaradí de Didi, con el cual tanto se identificaban. Allí se levantó en el año 1937 la sinagoga tan bella de estilo racionalista que conservamos y disfrutamos hasta hoy en día. Es un espacio muy amplio y cálido, de techos altos y ventanas con vidrio, en el cual seguimos disfrutando de hacer nuestra tefilá y festejar nuestras fiestas. Este templo en sus primeros años fue el sitio de la jupá de muchos de nuestros abuelos. Repetimos muy seguido y hacemos consciente nuestra gratitud a aquellos héroes, nuestros abuelos y bisabuelos, que llegaron tan lejos, padecieron el exilio, la inserción en una cultura ajena y, sin embargo, pusieron todos los recursos para construir esta casa que nos permitió y nos permite llegar a nuestro oasis, donde nos reciben siempre con un abrazo fraternal. Nos sentimos protegidos y podemos practicar y hacer crecer nuestra práctica ancestral judía. Más avanzado en el tiempo, en el año 1945, se logró la adquisición de un terreno en las cercanías del templo, donde se levantó un edificio en la calle Kramer, con el objetivo de desarrollar actividades sociales y deportivas, inaugurado en el año 1953. Nuestra infancia fue muy significativa y nuestra formación en valores judíos y en valores universales en gran parte se forjaron en las actividades juveniles de este amado Shalom. Allí jóvenes mayores formaban a niños judíos. Grandes dirigentes juveniles nuestros fueron Roberto Azar, Dani Barqui, Freddy Berro. En el club se desarrollaban eventos culturales como recitales, bailes y obras de teatro. Eventos muy preciados y esperados por los asociados que tenían una alta calidad. También los campamentos juveniles eran espacios imperdibles, cuyas vivencias quedan aún selladas en nuestra memoria. Otros espacios muy significativos fueron las justas deportivas intercomunitarias y las januqueadas, espacios de una semana de duración donde todas las familias de la comunidad competían divididas en grupos. En los años 60 se constituyeron grupos juveniles de un movimiento denominado Tejesacna, con la intención de fomentar la aliyá, en lo que fue el brazo sefaradí del movimiento sionista en la Argentina. Hoy en día familias de 3 o 4 generaciones de Shalom viven en nuestra amada Medinat Israel a raíz de este movimiento juvenil que se desarrolló en nuestra comunidad. En el año 1967 se creó la Escuela Integral Shalom, un proyecto para el cual se adquirió un terreno contiguo al templo. Allí se formaron un número importante de individuos de nuestra Keilah, así como también niños judíos de las diferentes comunidades de la ciudad de Buenos Aires. En su momento, allí, muchos niños adquirieron sus conocimientos judaicos y nuestro idioma nacional y híbrido. Lamentablemente, a raíz de las crisis económicas continuas en la Argentina y a los cambios de patrones culturales, es que hoy no están en funcionamiento nuestro club ni nuestra escuela. Pero sabemos por manifestación permanente de muchos individuos que nos cruzamos en diferentes espacios del impacto positivo tan marcado que han dejado en ellos y en nuestras vidas. En medio de este crecimiento comunitario, un evento trágico que marcó a nuestra Keilah fue noticia y cruzó el océano. Relatando la deportación un 27 del mes de Av del año 1944 de la totalidad de nuestra comunidad madre y su posterior exterminio a manos de los genocidas, lo que determinó el fin de siglos de presencia judía en Rodas. Aunque yo no presencié ese trágico acontecimiento, sé del dolor profundo y la conmoción que generó en nuestros padres y abuelos. La memoria de este episodio sigue muy presente en nosotros y en nuestros hijos, gracias al testimonio de nuestro héroe comunitario, don David Galante, quien logró sobrevivir al campo de exterminio de Auschwitz y arribar a la Argentina junto con su hermano Sicilia. Pasados más de 40 años, con la ayuda invalorable de nuestro rabino Momo Maravi, pudo romper el silencio y comenzar a relatar el horror de lo vivido en aquellos años negros. Fue un gran referente para mí y para nuestros hijos, que pudieron escuchar su testimonio relatado por él mismo. David nos dejó hace 5 años, pero su testimonio sigue vivo en nuestros corazones. Otro evento que nos marcó fue la recepción de la donación de nuestro Sefer Torah a nuestra comunidad. en el año 1982. Salimos todos juntos en cortejo desde el Club Shalom hacia el Templo Shalom, festejando a viva voz para dar la bienvenida a la Torá, que hacía entrada en nuestro pequeño Beit HaMikdash. Yo era un joven miembro de la comunidad, pero recuerdo el festejo de la llegada de ese tesoro que nos ligaba a nuestro pasado en Rodas y yendo más atrás con la misma separada. Este Sefer Torah, que está en guarda de exhibición en el renovado y moderno Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires, permite que miles de visitantes por año, incluyendo miles de alumnos de escuelas, se involucren en la triste historia de la Shoah de los judíos de Rodas y de la historia de toda la comunidad. Hoy en día podemos decir que mantenemos encendida la antorcha que nos legaron nuestros ancestros venidos de la isla de Rodas. Mantenemos viva una comunidad donde en forma diaria tenemos espacios de estudio de Torá y textos sagrados, en un ambiente familiar y en un clima de alegría permanente, por nuestra posibilidad de desarrollar libremente nuestra vida judía, donde festejamos la totalidad de los eventos del calendario judío, donde contamos con un grupo de jóvenes orgullosos de su herencia y de pertenecer al Templo Shalom. Podemos decir con orgullo que muchos líderes judíos de Buenos Aires y otras partes del mundo han iniciado su camino de Teshuvá, o sea, retorno a las fuentes en nuestra calidad. Es necesario transmitir la intensidad y la emoción profunda que se genera en nuestro templo en las altas fiestas. La comunidad de su conjunto se eleva en un rezo a toda voz, con las melodías ancestrales que heredamos de los mayores. Las canciones en judeo sobre las ataduras de Ishak o Kel de Anekad, en Rosh Hashanah y el Hora de Yom Kippur nos llenan de emoción, arrancando las lágrimas de muchos de los feligreses, cerrando siempre los Yamim Noraim con el Atikva que nos liga directamente a Eretz Israel. Quiero traer también a la memoria algunos de los grandes líderes religiosos que pasaron por Shalom. El Rab Shlomo Molko, el Rab Aharon Ángel, el Jajam Mizrahi, el Rab Mordechai Ederi, el Rab Yosef Stone, el Rab Mordechai Maravi, el Rab Aharon Shimol y nuestro actual líder espiritual, el Rab Gabriel Weber. También quiero reconocer y traer a la memoria a los dirigentes de nuestra Keilah, desde aquel mítico Salvador Tarica, que falleció en el año 1949 y empezó la tierra de Israel, pasándonos por nuestro querido Sami Nofika, que luchó por la unión y el crecimiento de nuestra Keilah en tiempos difíciles. Hasta el ingeniero Ernesto Casés, que dedicó muchas horas de su vida al crecimiento de nuestra comunidad, y que en tiempos de crisis pudo mantener en pie nuestros edificios, nuestra gratitud con ellos y con todos los dirigentes que no figuran en el teclado. Quiero expresar que he llegado aquí a nuestra amada Rodas junto a dos amigos de la infancia, Diego Levi y Alberto Tarica, nieto y nieto respectivamente de judíos de Rodas, al igual que yo, con quienes comparto la vida desde la más tierna infancia. Nuestras vidas fueron marcadas por nuestra comunidad Shalom. Nuestros recuerdos están invadidos por las vivencias que compartimos allí. Somos mucho más hermanos que amigos. Fuimos Haim, fuimos Madrihim y somos dirigentes de Shalom. Somos orgullosos hijos de este colectivo llamado Judíos de Rodas. Y hoy estamos cumpliendo una promesa hecha entre nosotros hace décadas: encontrarnos en nuestra Jerusalén del mar Egeo. Nos embarga una gran emoción. Y vinimos aquí a dar testimonio. De tal forma, estamos reconociendo a nuestros ancestros que sostuvieron viva nuestra herencia judía traída de España. Aquí en la isla, con todas las dificultades de ser siempre minoría y no siempre respetada. Estamos honrando y agradeciendo a nuestros padres y abuelos fundadores de la querida Rodería de Buenos Aires, que nos permitió forjar una identidad sefaradí muy intensa, y de la cual sentimos mucho orgullo y estaremos manteniendo viva la memoria de nuestros hermanos asesinados trágicamente en el Holocausto. Y parafraseando a nuestros hermanos de Europa, venimos a decir, henos aquí. Y queremos que quede muy claro el mensaje que traemos. Somos orgullosamente judíos, orgullosamente sefaradíes y orgullosamente rodríguez. Y nos comprometemos a sostener y pasar este legado a nuestros hijos y a las próximas generaciones. Muchas gracias.
I will explain something. Fabian has in his hand a gift to the Museum of the here in the Jewish Museum of Rhodes. In a corner, the synagogue was a memorial for the victims of the Holocaust, and some years ago we changed this memorial. The original one was from candle holders. Remember that? Fabian was to, or the Comunidad Shalom was to one of these candle remain in the museum. Together with the candle holder, there is a letter that say, in a quick translation that I just made, that say, I'm writing to you on behalf of my beloved Shalom Community Center to donate to the museum a piece that was part of our temple since its creation, a candle that accompanied us for almost 100 years, lit by our grandparents, parents, siblings, ourselves, and even our children, and which we now wish to have as part of this museum that honors us. We know that we are fulfilling the legacy of those who, with great effort, settled in the Colegiales neighborhood of Buenos Aires, Argentina, in the beginning of the 20th century, and never doubt for a moment that where they were going to live, there had to be a them. Just as they worked on a beautiful building, they also built three pillars that we are now reinterpreting. Legacy, to continue with our values and tradition. By donating these candle holders, we know that they will be on benefit to this prestigious museum that works so hard for continuity. They illuminate the world, our Torah and good deeds have the power to radiate light upon lighting this candle. To practice Chesed, a quality that is the foundation of our community, to give tirelessly to others. That is why we want to give you this gift. Signed, Fabian Schoen.
So I'm going to switch some things here to organize our last presentation with Serafina, who is already present in the table. Yeah. Oh. So, Serafina just a second.
I prefer to present it myself.
Yes, just
I'm going to present
I'm
in
going to
my computer.
Yes, just a moment. Maybe somebody you can
Yes.
translate. Or Diego? Maybe you can translate. Just a second.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Yes. And just a moment. Just a Just a second, Serafina.
Yes.
Just a moment. Just a second. Just a second.
Yes.
Yeah. So now we have your presentation. And I'm going to help you. So Serafina, maybe you can say something like now when we want to go to the next slide. But I'm going to introduce you now for our other participants. So it's a great honor for me to welcome Serafina Perry, our last speaker today, curator of collections at the Buenos Aires Holocaust Museum, who has recently completed her PhD. Congratulations again, Serafina, for social anthropology. I had the pleasure of working closely with her during my stay in Buenos Aires. She supported me immensely and in my work and was a wonderful colleague for 3 weeks. Serafina's work at the Holocaust Museum exemplifies the integration of scholarship and curatorial practice. She oversees the presentation, documentation, and interpretation of the museum's collections, ensuring that each object functions as a medium for historical knowledge, memory, and critical reflection. Her research demonstrates how material culture has embodied complex narratives of persecution, survival, and community resilience, providing both scholars and the public with a tangible connection to the past. Today, Serafina will speak about the great tourist role at Buenos Aires Holocaust Museum. And yes, please, the stage is yours, and I'm looking very much forward. And please just say something like, now I'm happy with your presentation.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for the presentation. Is Fanny known?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Yes.
And I also gave you a translation of speech, which will be in Spanish. Yes. Yes.
Speaker translate and then you will see.
Ja, ich sehe das ja schon. Wo ist das?
Ansicht, rechts oben.
Ah ja.
Und dann Speaker.
Yes. Now we have you. and full sight, and we can see you. So please. So now, please. Yes. Yes.
Buenas tardes, ¿cómo están? Gracias por su presentación, Anet. Es para mí un honor participar de este workshop. Agradezco a los organizadores, Anet Martín, Marcelo Contreras, por hacer posible este encuentro tan importante para todos. Y por supuesto a todos ustedes por estar hoy aquí. Espero generar muchas respuestas y muchas preguntas a partir de esta charla que dejo abierta a la reflexión. ¿Qué sucede cuando un objeto sagrado, moldeado por prácticas rituales y memorias colectivas, ingresa a un museo? Esta charla está centrada en el despertar del Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires y se articula siguiendo esa pregunta gallega. El despertar puede ser pensado como un objeto en el devenir, cuya geografía no es lineal ni unívoca, sino que está atravesada por múltiples comienzos, por distintividades e indistintividades y por distintos regímenes de valor que se activan a lo largo del tiempo. Aquí tenemos el despertar apenas arribado a nuestro mundo. Para hablar de este objeto tan complejo, les voy a contar mi primer encuentro. Mi primer encuentro con el César Torá ocurrió en 2019, cuando fue cedido por Rodato, gracias a la generosa contribución de la comunidad Shalom de Buenos Aires, para ser incorporado a la exposición permanente como parte del proceso de revitalización del museo. El rollo se encontraba dentro de una sólida caja de madera diseñada para preservar su identidad. Y en su parte central estaba envuelto, aquí se ve, por una banda de tela con la inscripción en hebreo en el nombre de Dios que no se pronuncia, y remitiendo así a su origen sagrado. Al contemplar la gran Torá, sin ser creyente, la experiencia fue profundamente conmovedora. Esa experiencia me llevó a reflexionar sobre el potencial de ciertos objetos. Cuando hablo de objetos museológicos. En este sentido, los museólogos y las museólogas establecemos una relación particular con los objetos que pueblan los museos, los investigamos, analizamos, preservamos, comunicamos e interpretamos como fuentes fieles y objetivas de conocimiento. Para nosotros, todos los objetos comparten el mismo valor, por ser testigos involuntarios de la historia y soportes materiales de la memoria. Sin embargo, debo decir que la presencia del César Torá me condujo a pensar, ¿todos los objetos operan del mismo modo? ¿Es suficiente la lógica museológica para dar cuenta de la densidad de significados y sentidos que algunos objetos condenan como el César Torá? Estos interrogantes exceden al alcance de esta presentación, simplemente los quiero dejar abiertos a la reflexión para pensar juntos todos los objetos tienen el mismo valor o hay que empezar a pensar en otra cuestión. En algunos momentos de charla voy a nombrar el César Torá como gran Torá para subrayar su singularidad. Me apoyo en el carácter polisémico del término gran para dar cuenta por un lado de su imponente presencia material y por otro de la riqueza simbólica que condena. En este marco, y sin pretender clausurar las preguntas que recién realicé, propongo pensar el CEPETORA como un objeto total, en el sentido que Marcel Mauss otorga al fenómeno social cuando habla de que es un fenómeno social total, trasladado a los objetos museológicos y al CEPETORA en particular. Este objeto asume y condensa simultáneamente dimensiones religiosas, sociales, éticas y estéticas. Para desarrollar esta mirada de objeto total, me apoyo en dos enfoques teóricos antropológicos. La noción de devenir concomitante de los objetos elaborada por el antropólogo británico Tim Ingold, que nos invita a pensar los objetos no como entidades cerradas, sino como procesos en curso, en devenir. Y la propuesta de la biografía cultural de las cosas de Igor Kokotov, quien sostiene que los objetos, al igual que las personas, poseen una trayectoria vital, marcada por cambios de estatus, usos y significados. A continuación, puntualizaré algunos aspectos de la Torá que, si bien son ampliamente conocidos, resultarán significativos para el análisis posterior que realizaré. Un Sefer Torá es uno de los objetos sagrados más importantes del judaísmo, consiste en un rollo de pergamino escrito a mano por un escriba, Sofer, especialmente formado para esta importante tarea. Su escritura sigue estrictas reglas galácticas, la ley religiosa judía, y un solo error puede invalidar todo el texto. El pergamino se elabora a partir de la ley de la piel de animal kosher, oveja, cabra o vaca, sometida a procesos de limpieza, curada y secado, para garantizar su resistencia y aptitud para la lectura. Su uso se remonta al menos al siglo II a.C. y su nombre proviene del pergamino, que todos sabemos, donde se consolidó como alternativa al papiro. Los pliegos que cosen y desarrollan sobre dos vías de manera natural, llamadas chain, árboles de la vida, que protegen el pergamino del contacto directo. Como cita la Biblia, es un árbol de vida. El Sefer Torá del Museo del Holocausto es de pergamino y se encuentra montado sobre dos vías de madera clara que corresponden a una incorporación más reciente. En el extremo de la vía derecha, aquí se puede ver, se distingue una inscripción en hebreo realizada en tinta negra. Por su materia y por tratar de texto escrito, no grabado, es posible inferir que es una etapa más reciente. En la parte superior, aquí abajo se ve, en la parte superior sobresale un remate de notable factura, ejecutado en material óseo o marfilino, conformado por anillos moldeados, calados y ondulados que coronan de alguna manera la gran rara. Esta ornamentación estratificada, abierta y dentada remite a una lógica constructiva de fortaleza, con baluartes que evocan la lumina. Es una Torá heteronormada, además de ornamentada. Este coronamiento no es muy habitual, por lo que constituye un rasgo distintivo del objeto. El estado de conservación del Sefer Torá en el Museo del Holocausto presenta una inestabilidad relativa, favorecida por el proceso de secado y curado de la piel con sal, que ayuda a prevenir la humedad y la contaminación biológica. La sal es fundamental en este proceso, como ocurrió con los llamados rollos de pan muerto, cuya preservación se vio beneficiada tanto por el tratamiento de la piel como por las condiciones ambientales de esa salubridad. Aún así, el pergamino en el Museo del Holocausto presenta un color oscuro por las huellas del tiempo, desprendimientos en los bordes que se pueden ver. Estos desprendimientos son conservados en un contenedor de ácido que vamos guardando por tratarse de un objeto ritual. Tiene manchas persas y se ven restituciones de material realizadas con anterioridad y algunas adherencias al final de la hidroyaga. Todas estas marcas dan cuenta de su antigüedad y de un uso prolongado. En la exposición, el Sefertorá se encuentra expuesto en la planta baja del museo, hacia el tramo final del recorrido de la muestra permanente, en una vitrina cuadrangular revestida con madera, con soportes de acrílico que sostienen ambos ejes y permiten una amplia apertura sin comprometer su estabilidad. El espacio fue diseñado especialmente y cuenta con condiciones ambientales controladas. Por ejemplo, está en semi-membrana. Todo esto acorde al criterio de conservación preventiva. Es el único objeto exhibido en este sector, lo que enfatiza su gran dimensión y singularidad. Aquí se encuentra la parte de la exposición, como en el que está solo, por su gran presencia. El contexto expositivo del Sefertorá se prolonga visualmente hacia esta pared ascendente que amplía la percepción espacial y en la que se exponen imágenes de puntos y espectadores. A la derecha, aquí se encuentra el Sefertorá. De este lado se encuentra la pared ascendente y de este lado, a la derecha de la Torá, una pared despejada incorpora la inscripción: quien salva una vida, salva el mundo entero, invitando al visitante a reflexionar y mirarse corporalmente en el espejo y reflexionar sobre el tema. La trayectoria del Sefertorá en el museo. Se exhibe desde diciembre de 2019 en la inauguración del museo. Fue retirada en dos oportunidades para tareas de acondicionamiento y limpieza y de manera excepcional para la investigación realizada por la doctora Anel Martín. Aquí presente. La decisión de disponerla para su estudio en la sala de guarda, aquí esta es la sala de guarda, ¿sí? Modificando en este momento su contexto protegido, fue evaluado de manera conjunta con la comunidad de salón y la dirección del museo, teniendo en cuenta diferentes criterios de conservación preventiva y aspectos logísticos, mover la Torá para la Argentina. El intercambio de avances con la doctora Martín y la posibilidad de una nueva adaptación hicieron de este proceso una experiencia especialmente enriquecedora para mí. Aquí estamos en la sala de guardia de la oficina, Marcelo Benítez, Anel Martín, una compañera de trabajo y yo a la derecha. Bueno, como les dije al comienzo, voy a tratar al Sefertorá como un objeto total y además sumando los aportes de los antropólogos Kokotov y Igor. Entonces vamos a trabajar la biografía cultural de los objetos. El antropólogo Igor Kokotov sostiene que los objetos, al igual que las personas, poseen biografías, que no necesariamente son lineales ni unívocas, sino que se encuentran atravesadas por distintos regímenes de valor y prácticas sociales. ¿Qué es un régimen de valor? El régimen de valor es definido por Ayush Padurai como el conjunto de criterios, prácticas y significados sociales que en un contexto histórico determinado definen qué es un objeto, cómo debe ser utilizado, cómo circula y qué tipo de relaciones activas, como sucedió con la Sefertorá. Entonces, siguiendo a Kokotov, propongo iniciar la biografía del Sefertorá a partir de las dos dataciones por carbono 14, que lejos de constituir evidencias en conflicto con la historia, deben ser integradas como instituciones biográficas, parte de su biografía, que activan comienzos diversos vinculados a regímenes de valor y a contextos históricos específicos. Lo que quiero decir que no una datación no anula la otra. Siguiendo el doctor, estas dataciones se unifican, porque son distintos momentos de la biografía y del despertar. Momento acá. Muy bien. La biografía del Sefer Torah tiene una primera fase que se activa con la datación realizada en 2001 por iniciativa de la Comunidad Shalom de Buenos Aires, que se sitúa su origen entre los siglos 12 y 14 en la península ibérica. En este escenario, el Sefer Torah se inscribe en un régimen de valor litúrgico y comunitario, propio de las comunidades sefardíes medievales. Tras la expulsión de los judíos en 1492, el objeto habría acompañado a estas comunidades en su desplazamiento. Su estatus aquí, su régimen de valor, es marcado por la dispersión y posiblemente por el ocultamiento y por estrategias de supervivencia frente a un contexto histórico extremo. La segunda fase de la biografía del Sefer Torah se activa a partir de la datación obtenida del 2025 como iniciativa de la doctora Martini, que ubica su origen en la Edad Moderna, modificando de esta manera el marco geográfico previamente establecido. Y esto, lejos de constituir una carencia de información, la definición y definición geográfica abre un nuevo camino interpretativo de la biografía del Sefer Torah. Si consideramos la hipótesis de su realización en el Medio Otomano en relación con el asentamiento de comunidades sefardíes, tras la expulsión de España, esta indeterminación podría leerse como el resultado de protección y resguardo profundamente arraigadas en la comunidad sefardí después de 1492. Como puede observarse, ambas dataciones operan como dispositivos narrativos que habilitan lecturas diferenciadas de la trayectoria del Sefer Torah. No se limitan a indicar un momento de evolución, permiten interrogar los modos en que el objeto fue pensado, valorado, protegido, ocultado o activado en contextos históricos específicos. Las fases de visibilidad o invisibilidad depende del contexto, ya sea por proclamamiento, desplazamiento, resguardo o silencio, no son vacíos documentales, sino momentos sociales históricamente significativos sociológicamente. Y lejos de señalar una ausencia, estos intervalos habilitan una reflexión sobre las condiciones políticas, religiosas e históricas que volvieron al objeto, al Sefer Torah, vulnerable, perseguible o pasible de destrucción, así como las estrategias desplegadas para garantizar su preservación. En otras palabras, cada datación produce dos. Una activa un régimen de valor litúrgico, comunitario propio de un sefertí medieval. Otra pone en juego un régimen moderno de protección, memoria y recuerdo. En ambas trayectorias medieval o moderna, el valor del Sefer Torah es resignificado no solo como objeto ritual, sino como garante de la continuidad religiosa y cultural judía en contextos diaspóricos o en contextos atravesados por la inestabilidad. Pero la biografía del Sefer Torah no termina aquí. Durante la Shoah, el régimen de valor del Sefer Torah se transforma nuevamente al pasar del objeto litúrgico de uso público a un bien confiado a la comunidad musulmana de Rhodes para garantizar su preservación. Con este gesto, el Sefer Torah encarna la materialización de la solidaridad intercomunitaria. Tras el Holocausto, recupera su visibilidad plena. En esta fase, el objeto es singularizado por su carácter sagrado, pero también por encarnar la memoria de Chihuahua. En la década de 1980 se entrega a la comunidad Shalom de Buenos Aires inaugura una nueva etapa en su biografía, en la que se reafirma su valor religioso, solidario y comunitario. Como afirma Marcel Mauss, todo traspaso de un don involucra sentidos, obligaciones y valores intangibles que exceden al objeto material entregado. La biografía continúa con su incorporación al Museo del Holocausto y allí atraviesa una nueva transformación. Sin perder su identidad simbólica y su carácter religioso, adquiere un nuevo valor teológico y patrimonial. Se convierte en documento, testimonio y portador de la historia, en el dispositivo de memoria y en el objeto de estudio abierto a nuevas perspectivas, públicos diversos y múltiples interpretaciones de aspectos que adquieren nuevas formas de aprender. En suma, la biografía del César Torá atraviesa distintos regímenes de valor: religioso, de protección, de salvaguarda, de solidaridad, museológico patrimonial, objeto de investigación. De un régimen litúrgico y comunitario a un régimen de desplazamiento, recuerdo y protección. Y luego un régimen de memoria y testimonio patrimonialización. Estas trayectorias de vida no agotan todos los recuerdos posibles de su biografía, pero permiten identificar algunos de los caminos significativos que un objeto puede transitar. Como les dije al comienzo, íbamos a abordar al César Torá desde la perspectiva de Tim Ingold. Tim Ingold considera que los objetos no constituyen entidades acabadas ni formas cerradas, sino procesos de movimiento, conformados por flujos de materia incompletud y devenir. Este enfoque plantea, este enfoque que se llama neomaterialismo, plantea un desafío ontológico. Ya que debemos concentrarnos en las formas finales de los objetos, pero no siempre en los procesos materiales y relacionales de los asuntos. Como sostiene Ingold, vemos el edificio y no el revoque de sus paredes, las palabras, pero no la actividad como que fueron. Así, en este sentido, podemos pensar al César Torá que lo vemos, pero no vemos todos los procesos que lo hicieron posible. No vemos la transformación de la piel en pergamino, ni el hacer prolongado que articula gestos, técnicas, saberes sentidos, donde la materia se modifica y la interacción con las manos que la trabajan, la sal y la cura, el tiempo de pecado y la atención minuciosa que clama la intervención. Vemos al César Torá, pero no percibimos el esfuerzo de los agricultores, el desgaste de sus manos secas por la sal, ni el sol que fue el fuego. No advertimos la resistencia de la aguja de atravesar la piel y los pelos lastimados en esas puntadas precisas que unen cada hoja. Detrás de la escritura sagrada se encuentra el estricto cumplimiento de las normas galácticas que regulan cada letra, cada columna y cada renglón, así como la formación prolongada del escriba y la precisión de una mano entrenada, muchas veces trabajando a la luz de la luz. Vemos al César Torá, pero lo vemos así que construyeron su caja, modificaron sus parámetros, confeccionaron sus pájaras o repararon sus partes dañadas a lo largo del tiempo. Nos deslumbra el remate de la corona, pero permanece invisible el tallado, el trabajo paciente del artesano y el tiempo invertido en esto posible de la forma. A la luz de todo lo expuesto, podemos comentar que la gran Torá condensa una extraordinaria densidad de sentidos y significados. Aquellos que habitan su materia, pero también los que se inscriben en las personas y en las redes de relaciones que la produjeron, la sacralizaron, la protegieron, la invisibilizaron, la custodiaron y la trasladaron de un territorio a otro a lo largo de distintos momentos. Por todo ello, el Sefertorá puede concebirse como un objeto total, un mundo vida que asume y presume memoria colectiva, lo visible y lo ausente, lo dicho y lo silenciado. En este sentido, considero que el objeto no es, sino estar bien. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Serafina. I think it was wonderful because you closed the circle from to this place where this workshop originally were planned together with Marcelo. And thank you so much for this. Maybe we have some question Spanish, please. That would be great. Or maybe somebody can translate. Yes. So if you have some questions. Yeah, we have one question, and maybe Marcelo can come here so you can see him.
With the density of the materials and the history that is embedded in the process of making the Torah, how is it going to be, like, are there any plans to display that in the museum? Because you said something about the scroll, you know. Are they planning more for the exhibition?
So
Hola, Serafina.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Muy bien.
Gracias por la presentación.
No, por favor. Preguntan aquí cómo fue el proceso de llevar a lo que era el Sefer cuando lo recibiste para llevarlo a una muestra para la gente, si qué cambio hubo que hacer o qué trabajo tuvo que hacer para darle el carácter de exhibición a algo que no lo tenía.
Sí, fue muy complejo. Muy interesante la pregunta, gracias. Fue muy complejo, porque primero tuvimos que acondicionar el Sefertorá, luego lo tuvimos que
Was very complex. First, they need to prepare the Sefertorá. Sí, está Flavia.
Sí, hablamos con un arquitecto que hizo el montaje de acrílicos sobre lo que sostienen los dos ejes.
They took with the architect in order to prepare the pedestal to display, to maintain the stand the Sefer.
Y también estábamos con el tiempo muy corto porque estaba ahí nomás la inauguración de nuestro museo. Así que estábamos trabajando hasta las 10 de la noche. Fue una tarea ardua, pero muy interesante y muy enriquecedora. Recuerdo que a las 10 de la noche...
They have a short time to do that because they were close to the inauguration of the museum. I will add. The museum was closed for 2 years in a master plan, and they made a fantastic museum today. And they were close to this inauguration, and they had to work at night in order to arrive in the day.
Bien, y una vez instalado hicimos varias pruebas a ver si quedaba bien el acrílico, eso también fue bastante complejo, y luego tuvimos que ponerle aparatos que midieran la edad.
they did many tests and put a sensor to check the humidity.
Bien. Una vez que estuvo montado, como dije en la charla, lo sacamos 2 veces porque para terminar de acondicionarlo, de limpiarlo, porque yo consideraba que había que seguir haciéndole cosas.
They continue with cleaning the patio. ¿Hicieron el trabajo en el pergamino?
De limpieza y acondicionamiento.
The only thing that they did was cleaning and nothing else.
Sí, la política nuestra es no intervenir al objeto, ningún objeto.
Our policy is to do not intervene the object.
Entonces, se acondiciona, se limpia, se dejan las mejores condiciones y luego se controlan estas condiciones.
They clean the object and after that only check the conditions. Bueno.
Sí, es eso.
Okay. Tell me.
We don't know exact circumstances of how Paris was written when how it moved from Spain to Rome. But we do have very particular dates of what happened with this role during the war.
I want to tell you later. I think I can tell the story in the World War II.
From 1945 until
Yes.
Argentina. What happened?
No, not 45. Not Argentina in the 80s. 1980s. 83, I think. Okay, I tell you, this is a question for me, for
What reasons were there for moving it? So from Rome to the Shalom community and then the Shalom community to the community.
I answer all this question. To Serafina, something, Serafina?
There are some other questions for Serafina, or shall we just thank you again? So,
when you want,
so Serafina, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully see you back in Buenos Aires. Hopefully, that would be great. So thank you so much. Thank you. Bye. Wow. So now, we are done. We have finished our second presentation session. But we are not usual because tomorrow morning we are going to meet each other again at 11 o'clock at the Public Mama and we will get a guided tour to the very precious and wonderful library at 11 o'clock. The Agana library is written at 11. And I also would like to invite you for us tomorrow if you have time and not already on the way to your lives, hopefully. So maybe you can contact me in the old city to just come together and do some reflections.
If anyone flying back tomorrow,
yes.
Where will we meet at the
Yeah, but so maybe we can meet at this to the library will take 1 hour. And then everybody calculated for last
Órale.
together it was to be
Órale, de tanta entrada.
But I would also like to take a chance to thank you, all of you, for this beautiful, moving, and interesting presentations, which gave us like really so many little stones, mosaic stones to get something like that. And so happy to really plan this workshop here at Rose and not Berlin or and so getting the chance to hear all the stories and the personal stories, and this was really for us as academics, where we very much outer space, very far away from the real life, so here we get the chance to get this things together.
And then you have a picture for the project, but take a photo. Yes, with the banner. If you have
No, when I did say I can answer, I don't know now or later. If it's in enough time.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we have to start.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have to leave the room. But outside,
this is the photo.
you know. The beam, tea. Sí, se fueron Carmen.